Hi and welcome back to Respondent Behavior. This is video part 5. We're going to cover we're going to begin with objective 13. Objective 13 is to discriminate between examples and non-examples of reflexes. Objective 14 is for you to discriminate between examples and non-examples of conditioned reflexes. 15 is to discriminate between those abbreviations. 16 is to list and describe basic types of respondent conditioning procedures. And then 17 is to discriminate between examples and non-examples of respondent conditioning procedures. Objective 13, discriminate between examples and non-examples of reflexes. We're going to go through some ASRs. ASR 14, a reflex is A, a response, such as your eyes watering, B, when a response gets a reaction from another person, C, a response to a stimulus, or D, the reliable relation between an eliciting stimulus and a reflex response. A couple more seconds. Alright, I'll go ahead and close the poll, and the answer here is D, the reliable relation between an eliciting stimulus and a reflex response. So a response to a stimulus so answer C could refer to respondent behavior or operant behavior. We can't be sure because it's not specified what kind of stimulus. In other words, the function of the stimulus is not mentioned there. You would have to say eliciting stimulus if it's a stimulus that elicits reflex responses, and then a response doesn't specify the type of behavior, if it's respondent or operant. It doesn't say if it's a reflex response. Okay. Answer A is out because it refers, it's indicating the response part of a reflex. And then we don't really use the term reaction, so if you see that in an example, that's just a distraction item. Okay, ASR 15. So before you answer this ASR, what I'd like you to do is pause the video lecture here and go ahead and copy and paste that link into your browser and watch the brief video on the little Albert experiment conducted by John Watson. And now I just want to give you a heads up that the experiment that John Watson conducted was highly controversial and today would be considered totally unethical. So if you were conducting a research program at a major university and you submitted a request for a research protocol to your institutional review board, or IRB, they would not approve this study. So anyways, but it's a classic study in one of the earliest applications of classical conditioning to humans, and so it'll be good for you to get exposure to that. So go ahead and watch that video and then come on back, and then we'll do this ASR. Alright, I'll assume you watched the video. Welcome back. ASR 15, which of the following was the reflex in the little Albert experiment? Was it A, the activation syndrome, B, the conditioning procedure, C, the relation between the animals and the activation syndrome, or D, pulling away from the animals? A couple more seconds. Alright, I'll go ahead and close the poll. And the answer here is C. The reflex was the relation between the presentation of the animals, such as the bunny, and the activation syndrome, so the startle response and pulling, and including pulling away from startling and crying and things like that. And an increase in heart rate would have occurred as well. So anyways, it's the reflex, the relation between the reflex response and the presentation of those animals, because the animals were once neutral stimuli with respect to the activation syndrome in little Albert, and then they became conditioned elicitors through the pairing procedure. And so if you answer D, well, pulling away from the animals is something else. And anyways, even if it was respondent behavior, this would just be the response part of the reflex. The reflex is the reliable relation between the CS and the CR. All right, objective 16 is to list and describe basic types of respondent conditioning procedures. And so there are many different standard procedures for altering the function of neutral stimuli, turning them into elicitors, in other words, for doing respondent conditioning. And so I'm just going to introduce you to some of the prototypical or standard types of respondent conditioning procedures. And these are procedures used by scientists in laboratory conditions to study respondent conditioning. The first one is short delay conditioning. I'm just going to list them for you now, and we're going to go into detail later. The next one is long delay conditioning. Then you have trace conditioning, backward conditioning, and simultaneous conditioning. So let's look at short delay conditioning first. So the delay part of short delay conditioning refers to the time between the onset of the CS and the onset of the US. Short delay refers to a brief interval between CS onset and US onset. So in this diagram, time passes as you move from left to right. In the top part of the diagram, you have the conditioned stimulus, which is the tone. In the bottom, you have the unconditioned stimulus, which is food. And so the reflex response is going to be salivation here because the unconditioned stimulus is food. And so as time passes, there's the onset of the tone. And so the tone is on as time passes, and the tone is off. And so you can see there's a brief 1 second delay from when the tone is on, the CS, and the food is delivered. Right? There's a 1 second delay. There's a short delay there. Right? And so then you have food present, and then food is no longer available. Right? And then there's what we have here is a 30-second inner trial interval, because you can consider this pairing a single trial of pairing. And this is another trial of pairing. So you have the passage of time here, 30 seconds, and then tone on. It's briefly on, and while the tone is still on, the food is available, and the food is available here, and the tone is off, and then food no longer available. There's a short delay between the onset of the CS and the onset of the US. Notice that in short delay conditioning, the CS occurs before the US occurs, and there is overlap between the CS and the US. Long delay conditioning. The delay refers to the time between the onset of the CS and the onset of the US, the same as short delay conditioning. But long delay conditioning refers to a longer interval between the CS onset and the US onset. So here it's 20 minutes. So you have the onset of the tone is on for 20 minutes, and then the food becomes available. There's overlap between the food and the tone is off, the food is still available, then off. And now this time, and I chose these, in these examples, I choose the intertrial intervals and the delay, the length of the duration of the delay, relatively arbitrarily. Okay, it doesn't need to be 20 minutes and 1 minute. That's just in this example. So we have 1 minute passes, and then tone on again, and then overlapping food becomes available, and then tone off, and then food becomes unavailable again. So there's a long delay between the onset of the CS and the onset of the US, and there's overlap between the CS and the US in each trial. The CS occurs before the US, just like in short delay conditioning. Okay, trace conditioning. Now, trace refers to the time between the offset of the CS and the onset of the US. And this time is typically relatively long, so 30 seconds is considered relatively long here. And so notice that the CS is presented before the US, again, just like in short and long delay conditioning. Except the tone is on, and then it's off, and then there's this period of time where there is no trace of the CS. That's how I look at it. There's no trace for 30 seconds, and then there's food onset. Okay, so that's trace conditioning. Backward conditioning. It's the same as trace conditioning, except the onset of the US precedes the onset of the CS. Okay, so this time, so for example, in prior diagrams, the CS was on top, right? Because the CS preceded the US. Now the US is on top in this diagram because the first stimulus is on top. So the US, the food, is presented. And then with the offset of the food, there's a very brief delay here, or there's a brief delay here, or let's say duration, or a brief interval where this US is no longer present. And then there's the onset of the CS. In this case, it's a tone. Okay, and time passes, and then there would be another trial, and so on and so forth. But what's most important about backward conditioning for you to be able to state or recognize is that the US is presented before the CS, and there's no overlap between them. So it's the same as trace conditioning, except the onset of the US precedes the onset of the CS. Simultaneous conditioning, the CS and the US are presented at the same time. This is trial 1, tone and food onset and offset are the same. 30-second intertrial interval, and then trial 2, tone and food onset and offset are the same. Alright, objective 17 is to discriminate between examples and non-examples of respondent conditioning procedures. ASR 16, using dogs as participants in my study, I present meat powder and a bell in a certain arrangement. Which is which? A, the meat powder is the US, the bell is the CS. B, the bell is the US, the meat powder is the CS. C, the bell is the US, the meat powder is the UR. D, the meat powder is the UR, the bell is the US. Give you a couple more seconds. Alright, I'll go ahead and close the poll, and the answer here is A. The meat powder is the US and the bell is the CS, because the bell is a neutral stimulus that's going to turn into a conditioned stimulus. And for now, the meat powder is the unconditioned stimulus that's going to elicit a unconditioned reflex response. That's going to be salivation. Right. ASR 17, I present the meat powder and a bell at the same time. I'm using a trace conditioning procedure, A, backward conditioning procedure, B, short delay conditioning procedure, C, or simultaneous presentation, D. A couple more seconds. Alright, I'll close the poll, and the answer here is D, simultaneous presentation. ASR 18, I present the light for 35 seconds before I present the meat powder. And by 35 seconds before the meat powder, what I mean is that there's light onset, and then time passes, then light offset, and then 35 seconds goes by with no stimuli, and then I present the meat powder. I'm using A, trace conditioning procedure, B, backward conditioning procedure, C, short delay conditioning procedure, or D, simultaneous presentation. Couple more seconds. Alright, I'll close the poll, and the answer is A, trace conditioning procedure. ASR 19, I present the meat powder before I present the light. So I'm using a trace conditioning procedure, B, a backward conditioning procedure, C, short delay conditioning procedure, or D, simultaneous presentation. Couple more seconds. Alright, I'll close the poll. The answer here is B, a backward conditioning procedure. So this the meat powder is the US and the light is the CS. And so in backwards conditioning, you present the US and then you present the CS. In all the other, in the trace and the short delay, you present the CS and then you present the US. In simultaneous presentation, you present the CS and the US at the same time. ASR 20, I present the light for a few seconds. And then while it remains on, I present the meat powder. And while the meat powder is available, I turn off the light. And the meat powder remains for 3 more seconds. I'm using a trace conditioning procedure, A, a backward conditioning procedure, B, a short delay conditioning procedure, C, or a simultaneous presentation, D. Give you a couple more seconds. Alright, I'll close the poll, and the answer is C, short delay conditioning procedure. That wraps up this video part. I'll see you in the next video part, beginning with objective 18.